The first 8 seconds must feel like a door slamming shut behind the viewer, the kind of moment where a man realizes there is no going back. So imagine the opening shot. Moonlight over a silent plantation house, the wind rattling the shutters, and a narrator whispering like someone revealing a classified document. 9 bodies in 4 days, and the only person missing was the slave girl they bought to breed the next generation. These are not stories taught in American classrooms. These are the kinds of historical files sealed in courthouse basements, guarded by archivists with special clearance, accessed only by those willing to confront what the American South really was, a machine of control, breeding, psychological domination, and ownership of the human spirit. The Hammond plantation incident is more than tragedy. It is a crime scene, a suppressed record, a moment when a young enslaved girl, Celia, refused to die quietly and instead weaponized knowledge the world believed she did not possess. Tonight, you aren't just hearing a story. You are being handed a file that men in power hoped you would never read, and once you hear what happened inside that house, you can't unknow it. The official records say the Hammond plantation was a masterpiece of Southern wealth. Gleaming columns, polished floors, fine carpets, imported China. But that is the lie written for history. The truth, the one they never wanted men like you to understand, is that the place was a machine, an engine designed to convert human suffering into generational power. Every brick, every plate of food, every dollar gained was a ledger entry written in blood. Marcus Hammond didn't just run a plantation. He operated a psychological system, one that proved you don't need chains when you can shape the mind instead, reward the obedient, break the defiant, erase the identity. Then the body will follow the will of the master without complaint. And to the outside world, Hammond was respectable, a gentleman, a leader. Proof that evil rarely comes wearing horns. It arrives in tailored coats and speaks Latin at the dinner table. Celia entered this world not as a human being, but as a calculated investment, a wife purchased like a farm tool. A womb bought for profit, a life bought for ownership. The men of the South called this tradition. But she understood the deeper truth. When a system becomes monstrous, vengeance becomes sacred justice. Before the murders, there were whispers among the slaves, quiet warnings spoken when the overseers were out of earshot. Celia, they said, saw things. She could tell when a mule would collapse before it happened. She could predict when the weather would break before the sky even dark. And on the night she arrived at Hammond Plantation, she told an old house servant something that chilled him to the bone. He will not die in his bed. She spoke of Marcus Hammond, the master, as if she already knew the day and hour his legacy would collapse. Superstition, the white men called it. But slaves did not believe in superstition. They believed in patterns. Pain teaches that. Men who beat others eventually meet their own reckoning. But Celia was different. She wasn't just speaking fear. She spoke with certainty. Some said her great-grandmother was a West African priestess taken in chains. Some claimed the gift skipped generations and landed in Celia like a flame. Others said trauma awakens instincts in the human brain scientists still cannot explain. But this much is undeniable. Celia did not walk into Hammond Plantation blind. She walked in seeing a fate that the powerful could not imagine. And she knew the clock had already started ticking. Celia's first 3 weeks on the Hammond Plantation were not marked by violence. At least, not the kind people could see. Marcus Hammond was too intelligent for that. Men like him didn't break bodies first. They broke the mind. By morning, he was frozen stiff, eyes open, staring upward as if still pleading for help. The men carried his body toward the rocky wall where the others had been placed, but when they arrived, something was wrong. One of the bodies was missing, not toppled, not torn apart by animals, just gone. No tracks in the snow, no sign of struggle, just an empty space where a corpse had been leaning hours before. Panic rippled through the camp. Some blamed wolves, others whispered the unthinkable, that one of their own had taken the body. But who and why? That night, a new rule spread through the tents without anyone speaking it aloud. No one sleeps alone. No one leaves the fire. No one dies unwatched. Because the hunger had finally changed from suffering into something predatory. 2 nights later, the truth revealed itself in a way no one in the camp would ever forget. A scream tore through the wind, raw, violent, and cut short too quickly. The men rushed toward the sound, slipping on ice and stumbling through darkness until they reached the farthest tent, half collapsed under snow. Inside, lantern light flickered across a nightmare. A young worker named Rourke lay dead on the floor, throat torn open, not by an animal, but by human teeth. And beside him, crouched like something feral, was a man they all recognized. Stanley Penn, once a respected carpenter, now gaunt, blood-smeared and wild-eyed with unthinkable hunger. Stanley didn't beg. He didn't explain. He only looked up with the hollow stare of someone who had already crossed a line the others were still terrified to see. The overseers dragged him outside, tied him to a post, and beat him until he could no longer speak. But the damage was done. Everyone knew the truth now. The starvation had turned men into predators. Nobody talked about justice or burial or punishment. The only question burning in their minds was far worse. How long until someone else broke? And deep inside, some wondered something darker. Would they make the same choice when hunger finally tore their sanity apart? After Stanley was left tied to the post, the camp tried to pretend that order still existed. Men returned to their tents, tools, and routines, but something had changed forever. They no longer looked one another in the eye. Every cough, every stumble, every quiet moment was now a calculation. Who will collapse next? And who will be hungry enough to act? By morning, Stanley was dead, frozen upright, eyes glazed, snow collecting in his beard. The overseers ordered his body removed and burned, but the workers refused. Fire meant warmth, and warmth meant survival. They weren't going to waste fuel on a man who had already been judged. So Stanley's body joined the others along the stone ridge, another frozen monument to the madness that was beginning to grow. That was when the supplies wagon appeared in the distance, moving slowly, drawn by a single, exhausted horse. At first the men thought salvation had come at last. They gathered around, cheering, crying, praying. But when the wagon reached camp and the tarps were pulled aside, the truth broke them. No food, no medicine. Only tools, chains, and signed documents, new labor contracts that extended service for another year. The company had not come to save them. It had come to own them more completely. The men stared at the documents in disbelief, their breath steaming in the frozen air. The company representative, dressed in a thick coat and fine boots, spoke as if nothing was wrong. He explained that the delays, the weather, and the unexpected challenges had increased project costs. Therefore, every worker's contract would be extended. Anyone refusing to sign would face legal consequences, prison labor, seizure of property, or blacklisting from work in the entire territory. The overseers stood behind him with rifles, silently reinforcing the message. This was not a negotiation. It was ownership. A man could starve, freeze, break his bones handing mountains their future, but the contract still bound him tighter than iron shackles. Some workers broke down openly, falling to their knees in the snow. Others simply stared, numb, beyond anger, beyond fear. But a few, just a handful, felt something else take root inside them. Cold, unwavering fury. They realized what the company had known for weeks. The workers were never meant to survive the winter. Dead men could not demand wages. Dead labor erased debt. The signature lines on the documents might as well have been carved tombstones. And yet, somehow the company expected starving men to pick up pens and comply. That assumption would soon prove fatal. By the following week, the camp had become a landscape of ghosts. Half the men had stopped speaking, moving like marionettes with invisible strings, their minds fraying under the relentless weight of hunger and fear. The snowdrifts now resembled graves, each mound marking someone who had given in to the cold or something far darker. At night, whispers of rebellion threaded through the frozen air, hushed conversations about escape, about defiance, about taking what the company would not willingly give. It was during one of these nights that a small faction of men, 3 at first, decided to act. They had studied the guards' patterns, the timing of supply wagons, and even the horses' habits. Every detail became a weapon. They could not rely on strength. The winter had stripped that away. They could only rely on cunning, patience, and the raw desperation clawing at their bellies. The plan was terrifyingly simple: disappear into the mountains, survive the night, and return with fire, sabotage, or whatever else could strike fear into the overseers' hearts. No one spoke of it openly, yet everyone in the faction understood the unspoken truth. Once hunger and fear meet in the mind, morality bends, and as the first faint light of dawn crept over the peaks, they vanished into the blizzard, leaving the camp haunted and unguarded, a silent promise of chaos waiting to unfold. The morning after the disappearance, the camp erupted into confusion. The overseers swore the missing men had simply frozen to death. Yet every track in the snow told a different story. Careful, deliberate footprints leading deep into the mountains, vanishing as if swallowed by the earth itself. Panic spread through those left behind. Hunger had already sharpened suspicion into paranoia. Every glance between men carried the unspoken question, who will break next? Meanwhile, the fugitives moved like shadows over the icy ridges, their breaths ragged, their bodies trembling from cold and exhaustion. Each step was a negotiation between survival and sanity. They scavenged, they hid, and they watched the camp below like hunters observing prey. Every night, the blizzard became both ally and enemy, masking their movements while threatening to crush them beneath its frozen weight. The overseers, realizing the camp's fragility, tightened their control. Threats became executions, and minor disobedience was met with chains and beatings. Yet, with each act of cruelty, the survivors' resolve hardened. Hunger was no longer the enemy. It was the teacher, the forge that tempered their minds for what was coming. And deep in the mountains, the first fires of rebellion flickered, silent and dangerous, waiting to descend upon those who believed they held power over men who had nothing left to lose. By the second week, the camp had transformed into a living nightmare. The overseers' threats, once terrifying, had become background noise. The real terror came from within. Hunger was no longer a condition. It was a presence, a predator stalking every mind. Arguments erupted over scraps of food, over blankets, over warmth. Friends became enemies. Eyes darted constantly, measuring intent, calculating betrayal. One man, caught stealing a morsel from another, was left in the snow as punishment, a warning carved into flesh and frost. Yet in the shadows of this torment, the fugitive trio in the mountains watched, learning the rhythms of the camp. They observed which tents the guards checked least often, which paths through the snow were predictable, and how the company underestimated men driven to desperation. Every observation was fuel for their eventual return, and then the message was delivered, not through words, but through action. A lantern placed deliberately near the edge of the camp, the fire extinguished in the middle of the night, a sudden howl echoing from the peaks above. The men left behind did not know it yet, but the balance of terror had shifted. Those who believed hunger had broken the workers underestimated the true danger. Men who had embraced desperation were no longer victims. They were instruments of vengeance. At this point, pause and comment I walk through fire twice below. Seal yourself in the mindset of those who confront the unbearable. The camp had become a chessboard of fear and anticipation. Every shadow, every crack of ice, every whisper in the wind held a hidden meaning. The overseers tightened their grip, but their actions only revealed the cracks in their authority. Guards patrolled with rifles raised, yet each step betrayed uncertainty, a subtle recognition that the men they ruled were no longer entirely human. They were something sharper, something dangerous. The fugitives returned under the cover of a moonless night. Silent as ghosts, they struck with precision. Fires were set at the supply huts, tools sabotaged, and one particularly cruel overseer discovered hanging from the storage post, a warning carved into his coat. "We are no longer yours." Chaos spread like wildfire. Men who had endured hunger, humiliation, and relentless control finally unleashed the full force of their suppressed rage. Inside the camp, the remaining workers watched in stunned silence. The transformation was undeniable. Hunger had sharpened their instincts, stripped them of doubt, and fused them into a single, dangerous purpose. And just as quickly as it began, the night ended. The mountains swallowed the shadows, leaving the company officials scrambling, powerless and terrified. They had thought themselves masters. They were wrong. Now, every man in the camp understood a brutal truth. Survival was no longer about obedience. It was about embracing the darkness within. By dawn, the aftermath was undeniable. Smoke curled into the frozen sky, carrying the scent of burned wood and fear. The overseer's authority lay in ruins, their threats meaningless in the face of calculated fury. The men who had once knelt to survive now walked upright, their eyes burning with a new understanding. Control had always been an illusion. Hunger had broken their bodies, but it had forged their minds into instruments of a will no one could command. The fugitives returned to the mountains, leaving behind whispers that would haunt the camp for weeks. Every worker knew someone had changed the rules of existence overnight. They had seen that those driven to the edge could become unstoppable. that oppression could be returned tenfold through intellect, patience, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Company records would later describe the events as a disorder due to natural hardship. But the truth was far darker. These were men who had learned the subtle science of vengeance, the calculus of terror, and the art of survival when the world had declared them expendable. No one in the camp would ever see the winter or the company the same way again. A silent, brutal covenant had been forged between those who survived and the world itself. And in the distance, the mountains waited, holding secrets the company could never touch. Weeks later, the company sent inspectors, led by men who believed the situation could be contained with paperwork and threats. They found a camp still standing, but hollowed out. Tents remained, fires smoldered, and the snowball footprints that ended abruptly, as if swallowed by the mountains themselves. The remaining workers were sullen, silent, their gazes empty and yet impossibly sharp. They had survived what no man should endure, and in surviving, they had learned truths that could never be unlearned. The fugitives were never found. Some said they died in the wilderness, devoured by cold and starvation. Others whispered that they had vanished into the wider world, carrying the knowledge of what men could endure and how they could strike back. Their legend grew with every retelling, a shadow that haunted the company's calculations, contracts, and every subsequent winter expedition. Power, they realized, was only as real as those who believed it. Oppression could be endured, broken, and redirected. Every man who had stared into the abyss now knew it. The world's most dangerous weapon was not the rifle, nor the law, nor the chains. It was the mind of a man who had nothing left to lose. And in that truth, the frozen mountains whispered a lesson that would echo for generations. Survival is mastery. Darkness is power, fear is a lie.